Hello, everyone. So, on the occasion of the release on Netflix of the documentary about Niemann's alleged cheating in the Carlsen versus Niemann case, I'm taking this opportunity to show you again the game in question, the critical game. I hadn't yet had the chance to do this on my channel. So, this game was played in 2022, and we'll discuss the aftermath of this cheating case afterwards. Carlsen therefore had white. He opens with the queen's pawn, d4. Niemann replies with knight to f6. The push c4, e6. Knight c3 and bishop b4, which comes to pin the knight and thus diffuses the push to e4. That's why Carlsen is going to play g3. He will put his bishop on g2 on the largest white diagonal of the board. For those in the know, this is called the Catalan opening. The Catalan opening is the combination of the bishop on g2 and the duo of pawns c4 and d4, which will control the space. A whole set of important squares. Niemann does his kingside castling. He has developed his kingside very quickly. Bishop g2, and now Niemann counterattacks in the center with the push d5. Carlsen plays a 3. He attacks the bishop. So certainly the bishop can retreat, but that would mean a loss of initiative for Niemann, who decides to take the knight with check. Capture, and Niemann wins the pawn on c4. Now, to win this pawn on c4, Niemann has still conceded some assets to white, notably the pair of bishops. The pawn c4 is rather fragile, and white are the only holders of the bishop of dark square. So Carlsen develops with knight to f3, and the pawn on c4 can be recovered in one move, like knight to e5, which will come to attack the pawn without the pawn being able to be defended by a push to b5, because that opens the light diagonal for the bishop on g2. And so Niemann doesn't try at all to keep this pawn on c4. He plays c5, attacking the central pawn on d4 himself and looking to open the file to exchange the queens and to castle the white king. Carlsen prefers to finish his development on the king side. He does kingside castling, or takes on d4, the queen recaptures. And Niemann, once again, doesn't try to defend his pawn on c4. He plays knight c6, attacks the queen, and offers this exchange of queens. But obviously Carlsen is going to take back the pawn on c4. e5 is played, the knight defends the pawn, and the push to e5 frees the bishop so it can come to e6 to attack the queen. You have to understand the imbalances in this position. For now, Carlsen has the pair of bishops. That's an advantage in somewhat open positions because bishops are long-range pieces. On the other hand, he has a somewhat weakened pawn structure. Why? Because, as you can see, he has more pawns islands, more groups of pawns. There is a group of pawns here that is holding together very well, but there is an isolated pawn on c3 and an isolated pawn on a3, whereas black have two groups of pawns. So the black pawn structure is less fragmented. And moreover, the pawn on c3 will be the target of attack once Niemann develops his bishop and places the rook on the c file, a file that will directly expose this weakness of the pawn on c3. But for now, Carlsen completes his development bishop to g5. He comes to pin the knight on f6 and connects the rooks. It is often said that development is complete when the rooks are connected. Black player 6 attacking the bishop. Carlsen counterattacks on the queen. Niemann also counterattacks on the white queen. So the queens are going to be exchanged. Rook takes, queen, bishop takes. Rook takes a8, rook recaptures. Bishop takes, knight, pawn takes. And so here things have really changed on the board. There have been a lot of pieces taken. We have the same pieces on the board, a rook on each side, a bishop on a white square, and a knight. But the pawn structure, on the other hand, is different. And it's true that the exchange on f6 has also weakened the structure of the pawns for black. There are doubled pawns and an isolated pawn here. Nevertheless, the structure of the white pawns might still be a bit more vulnerable, because it's not so easy to go and attack the black pawns. Whereas the pawn on c3 is exposed on a semi-open file, which means the rook will be able to attack this pawn very quickly. And for the moment, the pawn on e2 is also under attack. Carlsen is not advancing this pawn, because the bishop would control the square f1 and might simply prevent the king from centralizing in the endgame. Because in endgames, we look for activity from the kings. Since there is less danger of checkmates, the kings try to participate in the game, in the fight, in controlling the squares. So what is Magnus Carlsen going to do? He is going to play king to f1. So we think, yes, that defends the pawn, but the king is pinned. But the idea is to come to e1 afterwards. Because if, for example, we simply play e3, then black play queen to d8. Controls the file, and the king won't be able to approach as easily as that. So king f1 was played. And you see on rook d8, king to e1. That will allow rook d1 to be played. And finally, to contest the file by offering the exchange of the rooks. Niemann plays knight a5, rook d1. And Niemann declines the exchange of the rooks. He moves back to the c file because he knows he has a target to attack, the pawn on c3. Carlsen plays knight d2, attacking the bishop, putting pressure on the pawn on b7, but is defended by the black knight. The bishop comes to e6. And here, Carlsen, rather than passively defending the pawn on c3, chooses to trade it. He plays c4, looking for an active position. He offers this pawn, because black can take it 3 times while it only has one defender. But Carlsen's idea is that if the knight moves, he'll get revenge on the pawn on b7. And if the knight stays on a5 to defend b7, black will take the pawn on c4 with the bishop. But after the exchange, the rook will lose control of the 8th rank. The white rook will be able to break into black's camp. And that's exactly what is going to happen. Bishop takes, knight takes, rook d8, check, king g7, and bishop d5. The bishop attacks the rook, the bishop attacks the pawn f7, and Carlsen's idea now is to play rook d7, to attack the pawn on b7 twice and the pawn on f7 twice. But Niemann will secure everything by bringing the rook back to c7. And in the end, for now, Niemann has a defensive position. His rook and his knight defend what Carlsen is attacking, but he has an extra pawn. A good extra pawn. The rook comes to a8. Attacking the pawn, Niemann plays a6, the rook comes to b8, and Niemann plays f5. The rook comes to e8, attacking the pawn on 5, but e4. We can see that Carlsen keeps attacking, but for now it's holding. And he's going to play the move, g4. To smash the black pawn structure, divert the f-pawn from protecting the e-pawn. Niemann plays rook c5, he attacks the bishop. The bishop retreats to a 2, knight c4 to attack the pawn, a 3. And here, Carlsen doesn't want to trade bishop for a knight. The computer considers this the best option. But why doesn't Carlsen want to do it? Because he thinks that after the exchange, the pawn on a 3 would be quite easy to eliminate. The rook could come to a 4 to take it out. And in the end, black would have 2 connected passed pawns on the queen side, 2 distant passed pawns. That would be very difficult to contain. And so Carlsen prefers to play a 4. For now, he preserves his pawn on a. But knight d6 comes to attack the rook while also defending the 2 pawns. Rook e7 is taken on g4. And now Carlsen is down 2 pawns. 1 less pawn on the queen side, 1 less pawn on the king side. So he plays rook d7, he attacks the knight. He hopes that this knight moves so he can win the pawn on fe7 with check. But this is where Niemann comes up with a very nice move in this endgame. I'm going to invite you to pause the video and see if you would play like Niemann here. So what did you think of? Here, Niemann found the move e3. A very nice move. We come to attack the white pawn structure. We take space on the white king. There are dangers. Dangers especially involving rook to c1, dangers of mates. And at the same time, this push of the pawn to 3 frees up the 4th square. That is to say, this push of the pawn to 3 is truly brilliant. Its purpose is to make the white king insecure, to weaken the pawn structure of white, and to free up the 4th square for the knight so that the knight can join the rook in further mating attacks. Well, for now, it's absolutely necessary to avoid it. Rook to c1 mate. Well, it wouldn't be just yet. It wouldn't be mate yet, by the way, because after rook takes knight, rook to c1, check, the rook could come back. Nevertheless, it's enough to exchange the rooks, take on f2, and the pawn becomes unstoppable in a single move. It's going to promote to a queen, so it's completely lost for white. That's why in the position after e3, Carlsen is going to eliminate that pawn on e3. But the knight establishes itself on f4. So Niemann lets go of the defense of the pawn on f7. But this knight on e4 is extremely well placed, blocking both doubled pawns. It makes the white king insecure by controlling 2 escape squares with the threat. Now the idea is to play rook to c1. That's why Carlsen is not going to take the pawn on f7 right away. In any case, this pawn is doomed anyway. There's the pawn on f7, the pawn on b7. The pawns are very weak. But here, Carlsen wants to solve his mating problems. He's going to play king f1, rook c1 check, king g2, rook c2 fork, and it's the bishop that takes on f7. Rook takes on e2 check, king g1. Rook e1 check, king g2. Rook e2 check for now. They're just repeating moves. And here Niemann, who doesn't want to draw, will play king f6. He steps out of the line of sight with the rook. Bishop d7 attacks the knight and the pawn. Rook d2, pin. If the bishop takes the knight, of course, it loses the rook. Rook f7 check played by Carlsen, king g6. And here the computer indicates that you should play rook e7. Try to trade the bishop for the knight. But Carlsen will bring his rook back to d7. His idea is simple. Is to play bishop takes knight check and win the rook. Niemann will play knight g5. Now bishop e4. Check doesn't work because the knight could take the bishop while defending the rook. But Carlsen plays the other move, which is bishop f7 check now, with the idea of capturing the rook. So he plays bishop f7 check. But the surprise is black play king f5. And when Carlsen takes the rook, knight f3, the fork and black recover the rook. King g2, knight takes d2. Carlsen plays a 5 to fix b7 and a 6 and create a target for the bishop. The idea is that the bishop can at some point attack the pawn. b7, eliminate the pawn on a6 and have this distant passed pawn, very close to promotion. But obviously Niemann counters with king e5. He takes away the d5 square from the bishop. And so in this endgame, there are 4 pawns against 3, and a black king better centralized than the white king. Carlsen plays king g3. He attacks the pawn on g4, but knight f1 check comes to attack the king and both pawns. And here, Carlsen ultimately doesn't want to go take the pawn on g4. He prefers to preserve his pawn on e3. He plays king f2, but knight takes h2, 4 pawns against 2. He's down 2 pawns. At this point, it becomes totally unfeasible. Still, he has a little idea. Carlsen plays a 4. You might ask me why? With 2 fewer pawns, he offers this pawn. Well, his idea is simply to prevent the king from controlling the d5 square and the e6 square. So the king takes on e4, the king still controls the d5 square. So the bishop can't use this d5 square. But on the other hand, the bishop can now use the e6 square to attack from behind this small pawn structure on b7 and a6 in order to get a distant passed pawn. King f4 is played, bishop c8, the knight comes to f3, bishop takes b7. The knight comes to a5, bishop takes a6, Carlsen has achieved what he wanted, but knight c6, the pawn is lost. Watch what he's going to do. Carlsen, he's going to play bishop b7, knight takes a5, and bishop d5. Now he's going to trap the black knight on the edge so it can't get out. But still, the position is lost anyway. Niemann is going to play h5. He has his pawns on h5 and g4. Carlsen plays bishop f7 to attack the pawn, but it comes to h4. Carlsen returns to d5 to trap the knight. But king e5 and Carlsen leaves the table. The bishop has to move, which will inevitably give an escape square to the knight, who will then be freed. And in this endgame, with 2 extra pawns, there's no doubt that black will manage to get a new queen and win the game. That's why resigning now is justified. Why did Carlsen accuse Niemann of cheating? As you probably know, it's because Niemann had a history. He had been identified as a cheater on the playing platform, chess.com, during online games. Niemann even admitted to having cheated in his youth, but he says that in over-the-board games, no. He says he has never cheated, and certainly not against Carlsen. And then relations deteriorate significantly. 2 months later, Niemann files a lawsuit against Carlsen, but also against chess.com, but also against Nakamura, the very strong chess player and YouTuber Hikaru Nakamura. He accuses all of them of conspiring against him and lying about the cheating. This story drags on for several more months. The following year, all parties reach an agreement. You were probably already informed about all this and in much more detail than I was able to provide. But since I had never commented on this game, and with the documentary coming out again, I thought it was a good opportunity to take an interest in it. And to present it to you in my own way, you can leave me likes, comments, share the video, support the channel, as usual. And we'll meet again for new adventures on the chessboards. Goodbye, community.